Hey, Midnight Stories here. The US government's most controversial experiment all started whenever the first domino fell in 1947. The government was in a Cold War with the Communist Party and was stockpiling enough arms and bombs to fight another world war. The government knew that building an arsenal wouldn't give them the competitive edge they needed, so they started looking in other areas to build that edge. In 1950, a scientist named Sidney Gottlieb pitched an idea to then director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, to buy $240,000 of LSD. To put that in context, $240,000 back then is equivalent to $2.8 billion today. Now that's one hell of an acid trip if you ask me. The idea was simple. Sidney would be the head researcher of an experiment that would teach the US government about mind control. Given the growing tensions between the US and the Communist Party, Alan Dulles was inclined to approve this research. So, they started a top secret experiment called MKUltra. MKUltra was an overarching experiment that had multiple morally evasive techniques to learn about mind control. This includes electroshock therapy, lethal poisons in small dosages, and LSD. Now, because there were so many experiments tested in 1950 to 1964, we can't possibly cover them all in detail. However, the CIA decided to get LSD in American citizens multiple ways. They got college students to sign up for the experiment. Second, they had prisoners sign up for the experiment thinking that they were developing a new drug to cure schizophrenia. And lastly, they drugged unsuspecting men at the bars. We're going to go ahead and cover the latter. Its codename was Midnight Climax, and I imagine that's enough foreshadowing for you to understand what the CIA planned to do. Nonetheless, I'll explain their plan. Over the course of 14 years, the CIA purchased multiple homes across the United States and turned them into secret CIA locations. The CIA then proceeded to hire women that preferred to do the type of work you'd expect from your wife in between the sheets. The CIA instructed the women to go to local bars and talk to men that seemed to be there alone. And when the men went to the restroom, the women would slip a hit of acid into the man's drink. After a few hours of courting the men, they would bring the unsuspecting victims back to their homes that the CIA recently purchased. These homes were designed to really set the mood. There were candles burning, music playing low, and pictures of French can-can dancers. Now, if you ask me, nothing sets a mood like French can-can dancers. Whenever you'd enter the bedroom, the windows had curtains so you couldn't see through them, and the nicest silk sheets money could buy. There was oddly enough a large mirror in each of the bedrooms. I bet you already guessed that those were two-way mirrors where the CIA would observe the behavioral patterns of the unsuspecting men. Now that the location was set, the mood was high, and the men were drugged, the women were instructed to make advances on the men. After the men finished doing the dirty, the women were supposed to try and get personal information from the men. The kind of personal information people wouldn't typically give to a one-night stand. The CIA would take note of any unusual information provided by the victims. It was simple. If the men provided unusual truths, then the mind control must have worked, right? Wrong. There were too many flawed variables with their experiment, and thus mind control was never figured out. In 1964, the experiment came to an end due to legal and ethical issues raised by some in the CIA. In 1973, a man named John Marks became a whistleblower about the experiment. Needless to say, the American public was outraged, and eventually, Alan Dulles, the CIA director, had to testify in front of Congress about his approval of the experiments. Unfortunately, Sidney had destroyed most of the evidence, but Dulles was able to furnish about 10 boxes of evidence and financial statements. This, coupled with Dulles' testimony to Congress, painted the horrifying tales of what happened during those 14 dark years. Dulles ultimately wasn't charged for any crimes because he claimed he authorized the experiments under the sanctions of national security. Go ahead and hit that like button if you think Dulles is the biggest scumbag of the 60s. Well, about 20 years later, in the 90s, Bill Clinton even gave an apology on national television about the illegal activities the government conducted in the 50s and 60s. The funny thing is, that wasn't the only apology Clinton gave in the 90s. So, what happened to all the victims? Well, some are alive and healthy, but some permanently lost their minds. Some even committed suicide. Even though the American government gave enough acid to its citizens that could supply an EDC concert, the government still hasn't compensated any of the victims. And to this day, some of the victims' children are currently in a lawsuit against the government for what they did to their parents. If you like this story and are interested in learning more about true stories, please subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know down below if you think that conducting these experiments were justified for national security. Until next time, Midnight Stories.